Okay, good morning. Good morning and welcome. We're learning about Moshiach, and we want to know how much the world is going to change when Moshiach comes. Some people are very excited for great change, and some people are very nervous about what kind of change could happen. So, let's see what we could work out. We began our conversation by quoting the Rambam. The Rambam seems to take a very rationalist approach and says, nothing's going to change, except... that's a Jewish way of speaking, right? Nothing's going to change except. So what's the exception? Rambam says, he paraphrases from the Gemara that there's no real difference between now and the time of Moshiach, except for the persecution of the Jewish people. No more anti-Semitism. I think we'll all welcome that, absolutely. But other than that, he says, that the world will conduct itself in the way that the world conducts itself. And it seems to be, as I say, quite rationalist and quite ordinary. Now that's a problem, because if you look in other sources, specifically we looked at two. We looked at a Gemara and we looked at a Medrash Toras Kohanim. And these other sources seem to indicate very clearly that there will be very major changes in the time of Moshiach. So, for example, when the Torah says that the wolf will lie with the lamb, the Rambam says that is allegorical. It doesn't mean wolf and lamb. It means the nations of the world. It's exactly the point, that we'll live in a time of incredible peace, that there won't be this horrible experience of anti-Semitism, and that's really how we're supposed to understand it. But when you look at the Medrash and the Gemara, they talk about other things. They talk about the idea that trees which previously were unable to produce fruit will now produce fruit. Now that sounds miraculous, I think, by anybody's account. And we're also going to talk a little bit later about other things like the idea of wild animals no longer being aggressive. So how do we reconcile that with the Rambam's suggestion that nothing supernatural is really going to happen outside of perhaps world politics? We made a suggestion. We tried to say that in the same way as the Rambam believes that the wolf and the lamb is allegorical, in the same way he believes that the idea of these trees bearing fruit is also allegorical. We do know that trees, and fruit trees in particular, represent people. Trees represent all kinds of people. Fruit trees represent scholars, and maybe that's the message, that everybody will turn into Torah scholars, even the most ignorant people who previously were unable to give value, to share, to teach. They will now be able to do so. That's the allegory, perhaps. But we said that doesn't really work for a variety of reasons, not least of which the fact that both the Midrash and the Gemara are talking about very pragmatic things in context. So it would seem very strange that suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, suddenly they would no longer be talking about pragmatic things. So we're back to square one, which is, how does the Rambam reconcile his view that there's no real difference between our world and the time of Mashiach outside of the political arena, with the view expressed in other sources that there will be some major and significant changes? So what we're going to have a look at over here is another suggestion of how perhaps it could work. This is from the Radvaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra, one of the medieval commentators. And he's going to take a view that there's a difference between in Israel and outside of Israel. So the miraculous experiences of Mashiach will be, in his view, limited only to the Holy Land, and the rest of the world is going to be life as we know it. Let's have a look. Now, just to construct this and put it together, just to give you a bit of context, the Rambam, like any other medieval commentator, had contemporaries of his who also weighed in and also had their opinions on the things that he had written. In the Rambam's case, there's a great sage, the Raavad, and the Raavad wrote what's called Hasogois HaRaavad, which is basically a very focused, I don't want to use the word attack because that's inappropriate, but a very focused analysis of everything that the Rambam writes, and he usually takes a different view to the Rambam. So we're first going to start with the Raavad's question to the Rambam, and then the Radvaz who's going to try and reconcile it. So let's have a look. It's the section called Gimel, paragraph Gimel. In the commentary of the Raavad, Makshe al divrei Rambam anal min apasuk beparashosenu. So the Raavad queries the Rambam's view that there's no major supernatural shift that's going to happen when Mashiach comes, and he says, what about the parasha in Bechukoisa, which we actually just read this past Shabbos? What about that? How do you reconcile that pasuk with what you're saying that nothing in the world is going to change? What's the pasuk? The pasuk says, Vishbati chaya ra'a min haaretz. Hashem promises us that what's going to happen is he will remove. Now, the word Ishbati is a tricky word, and a little bit later we're going to see that there are two opinions about how you translate it. It does come from the same root, the same shorish as the word Shabbos. I think you can see that in the word Shin Beis Tov, which is Shabbos. Shabbos is a time where you desist from normal activity. And the word mashbis could also mean to remove something completely. So the Torah tells us, Vishbati chaya ra'a min haaretz. One of the things that's going to happen in the time of Mashiach is that Hashem will remove wild, aggressive, or dangerous animals from the earth. Says the Raavad, she'ein hi moshel v'chida ela dvarim kipshutam. That's not allegorical. That's literal. There the Torah is telling us literally that in the time of Mashiach, there will no longer be the natural circumstances of wild animals. So Rambam, what are you going to say to that? According to the Rambam, nothing's going to change in our world. It's exactly as we know it, except for the fact that nobody's going to hate us. And there the Torah is saying very clearly, and there won't be predators. How do you explain it? So the Radvaz is the one who's going to offer an explanation, and we're going to try and see if the Radvaz's explanation might be a one-size-fits-all. In other words, if we accept what the Radvaz has to say, maybe that will explain how the Rambam reconciles his view with the other sources that speak about these great miracles in the time of Mashiach. So the Radvaz, also commenting on the Rambam, tackles the Raavad's question, and he answers as follows: Ve'ein zoi hasaga. He says, your question, Raavad, it's not a question. Kashem shekshar aksuvim mashal, gamze mashal. The first and easiest way to explain it is, have you not already seen? The Rambam has what we call a shitta. He's got a theme that runs right through, that he is consistent with in how he interprets all of these great prophecies, and his theme is that they are all allegorical. And then the Radvaz says, but you know what? Even if you want to take it literally, I can still explain it. Umamshech, he continues. So Radvaz basically says, look, the Rambam's view is that all of these things are allegorical. And when it says that there will no longer be aggressive animals, it actually means that there will no longer be aggressive people who want to harm the Jewish nation. Maybe that's the allegorical explanation. But he says, besides that, we can distinguish between how things play out in Israel and in the rest of the world. So he says, Shahadvorim em gam kipshutam be'eretz Yisrael, that the words, the predictions, the prophecies are literal in the Holy Land. And he proves it. Ketachsiv, as the verse says in the book of Yeshaya, Lo yoreu v'lo yashchisu bechol har kochi. That they, whatever they are, the forces of destruction, whether they be animals, whether they be people, whether they be spiritual, it's irrelevant. Lo yoreu, they will not do harm. V'lo yashchisu, they will not do damage. Bechol har kochi. Throughout my whole holy mountain, says Hashem. Why? Kimala haaretz, because the land, and the pasuk continues, Deis Hashem, will be filled with knowledge of Hashem. Haaretz hayedua. The land means you know which land. In other words, the Radvaz says that the hey hayedi'ah, the prefix hey, which is a definite article, it means the, always tells us that we know exactly what we're referring to. And that's a klal god. It's not something that the Radvaz made up. It is something that is consistent throughout Judaism. Then whenever we have ha at the beginning of a word, it means you know exactly what we are talking about. So haaretz, the land, that means you know which land we're talking about. Which land would we as Jewish people assign the definite article and say, that land, the land, capital L. Which land? Must be Israel. So therefore the Radvaz says, you see that the Torah is making a prophecy that in Israel there'll be no forces of damage, forces of evil. And therefore he extrapolates, V'chein v'ishbati chaya ra'a min ha'aretz. Look, when the Torah told us that there will no longer be predators, dangerous animals, the Torah used the same word. It said ha'aretz, meaning in the land, in Israel. That's where there will be no further threat of dangerous animals. But in the rest of the world, every other country on earth, as the Rambam says, Oilam kemin hagoy noyeg. The world will continue as normal. And there will still be venomous snakes. And there will still be lions. And all of the references about that there won't be animals, with regards to the rest of the world, they are allegorical. So the Radvaz makes a clear distinction. In Israel, every prophecy will play out literally. In the rest of the world, every prophecy will emerge as an allegorical expression of something that's going to happen in the world, all on the theme of world peace. Shechein Kosov, like the pasuk says clearly, "V'lo yisa goel goy cherev," no nation will lift a sword against another nation. V'lo yilmadu od milchama, and they will no longer study war. Ve'eretz Yisrael yiskayim apshat ve'hamoshel, and inside Israel you'll have both. You'll have the best of both worlds. Inside Israel there'll be peace, and there will also be all these other great miracles. No wild animals, trees that produce fruit, even if they hadn't done so previously, etc. That's the attitude of the Radvaz. Okay? So it's a great attempt, it's a great suggestion of how we could reconcile the Rambam. That the Rambam's saying nothing's going to change in the world, that is in the world. And the verses that say things are going to change in the land, that is in the Holy Land. So, al pizeh shloimar, let's now develop the Radvaz's approach a little further and explain that we could say lechaoira ki machloikes Rambam v'Ravad neutze behevdel shebein shnei ma'amorei Chazal hanal miteres kohanim u'masechta chsuvis oidos ilon israk. Now, what we're going to do throughout the Sikha is we're going to consistently come back to the two different sources that we had about how all trees will bear fruit in the time of Moshiach. One source was from the Medrash Toras Kohanim, the other was from the Gemara and Ksuvas, and they did not say the same thing in the same words. That implies that they have slightly different views. So at this point, we want to align, as we often like to do, we want to align the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, with Talmudic opinion. So we want to align the Rambam and the Ravad with the Medrash and the Gemara, respectively. Okay? So let's see how that works. B'Gemara Nemar, when you have a look in the Gemara, what does it say in the Gemara? It says, Ilon Eisrak Shebe'eretz Yisrael. There it says that these trees that had never borne fruit, the Gemara says specifically, what will happen will be in Eretz Yisrael. Only in the land of Israel. That's where it says that these trees will begin to bear fruit. Whereas if you look in the Medrash, there it says, there it says, without specifying geography, it says all, that's what it sounds like, all trees will bear fruit. According to the Midrash, it doesn't sound like the Midrash is making any distinction between Israel and anywhere else. So, so it would appear that this is the distinction. It would sound like the Ravad and... we'll plug it into the Ravad and the Rambam in a second. Let's not confuse things. Let's first see the distinction. It would seem that the Midrash is of the view that the whole world will experience supernatural change. That's why the Midrash does not specify where these trees are going to be that will start to produce fruit. It leaves it blank, it leaves it open. Why? Implying that in the whole world there will be trees that start miraculously to produce fruit. Whereas the Gemara that did use the words Be'eretz Yisrael in Israel must obviously believe that the supernatural only occurs in Israel, not in the rest of the world. And if that's the case, we can actually plug in the two opinions very neatly. If the So now it would be nice to have a table for this, right? We could say the Raavad aligns with the Midrash, and they both believe that in the time of Moshiach, the world changes completely, top to bottom, and we start to see miracles. And as we'll see in a moment, the Rambam will align with the Gemara. But before we do that, this is specifically talking about the trees that are going to produce fruit. The other source that we learned was about how they will no longer be dangerous animals. What about that? So let's see, as he writes parenthetically, V'kach gam bepasuk v'hishbati chaya ra'a min ha'aretz. When we refer to that pasuk that says that Hashem promises no more dangerous animals in the land, Shemimenu hikshal das Rambam, which was the precipitator for the Raavad attacking the Rambam's opinion. That the only reason the Raavad used that as a question against the Rambam is because the Raavad believes that it means everything's going to change, and it literally means throughout the entire world there will be no dangerous animals. And the fact that the Raavad dismisses out of hand the suggestion that this is an allegorical pasuk, it's also based on the same Medrash Toras Kohanim. So the Raavad is really consistent. He's taking the same approach as the Medrash. What does the Medrash say there? Okay, so as I mentioned, there were going to be two interpretations of what the word v'hishbati means. Says the Medrash, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ma'aviron min ha'olam. One opinion, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is mashbisim, or v'hishbati means Hashem is going to remove wild animals. You will never see a cobra again in your life. That's the one explanation, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer mashbisan shelo yaziku. Rabbi Shimon says, no, there will still be those animals, but Hashem will neutralize their dangerous side. So theoretically, you will see lions that can walk right up to you, docile. And this is borne out, by the way, in other psukim, where it speaks about the idea of a child playing in a viper's nest, without the fear. Asher lefi shtei hadayos muchach shekavonas hapasuk kipshutoi sheloi tiyena chayos rois. So either opinion that you take in the Midrash, the net result is the same. Nature changes. According to Rabbi Yehuda, nature changes because dangerous animals, poof, disappear. According to Rabbi Shimon, nature changes because the animals are there, completely docile. Befrat, and it's important to note that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon in that Medrash do not use the words, even though they're the words of the pasuk min haaretz, because they want to widen the possibility of this supernatural world, that it will be everywhere. Whereas the Radvaz would tell us that the Rambam dovetails with the language of the Gemara. That the great miracle of trees producing fruit will only happen in Israel. But in the rest of the world is normal. Okay, so let's review what we've got here. We started off with a quotation from the Rambam, where the Rambam puts forward as what would appear to be his overarching attitude towards the time of Mashiach, no major miracles. Oilam kamin hagoi noyeg. The world as we know it, minus anti-Semitism. That would seem to be the Rambam's view. We asked a question. What do you mean? We have a Midrash that says clearly that all trees will produce fruit, and we have a Gemara that says the same thing. We thought we could wiggle our way out of it by saying, yes, don't you remember that the Rambam says the wolf and the lamb is allegorical, so he probably says that's allegorical too. We found that difficult to support because the context, both in the Gemara and in the Midrash, of those conversations was dealing with really pragmatic things. So it's out of style. It doesn't make sense that either the Midrash or the Gemara would be talking about things that are tangible and practical, and then the one thing is actually allegorical. Doesn't make sense. So we dismiss that suggestion. Now we're looking at the Radvaz. The Radvaz says, I see that there's a debate between the Rambam and the Raavad whether the world will or won't change. The Rambam says the world won't change, and the Raavad says, well, what do you say then about the prediction that there'll be no further wild animals? Says the Radvaz, it's simple. It depends where you're talking about. The Rambam follows the view of the Gemara that there will be miracles isolated to the land of Israel. The rest of the world will only experience these things as allegorical change. The Raavad will follow the Midrash that says, big change is coming. The whole world is going to be different. And that's a nice, neat way to explain that there are two opinions, and both opinions can justify their stance based on verses in the Torah. So it appears as if we've settled this issue, except we really haven't. Because the Radvaz has some holes in his theory. Let's look at Dalet, paragraph Dalet. Unfortunately, the Radvaz, in his attempt to reconcile the Rambam with his other sources, leaves some gaps. The most glaring issue we're going to deal with is, how do you actually fit his view into the stated words of the Rambam? Let's look. Number one, Aleph. The most glaring problem. Mikach Rambam oimer bo'ofen stami shebi'mois Moshiach lo yizbatel davar mimin hagoi shaloilam muven she'eretz Yisrael nichledes gam nichledes bekach shekein ilu be'eretz Yisrael yisrach shur nisim elu begashmis hari gam ze bitul minhag shaloilam. The first glaring question to the Radvaz is, look, we understand what you've done over here, and it really makes a lot of sense, and you've shown that the Rambam interprets like the Gemara in Ksuvas, and the Raavad interprets like the Midrash. That's all fine and good, but let's not forget what the Rambam said. The Rambam made a statement, and it was a very powerful and sweeping statement. The statement was, the world will not change when Moshiach comes. That's how the Rambam said it. Now, whatever your feelings might be about different locations on the planet, the fact is, they're all part of the world, Israel included. So, if the Rambam says nothing in the world is going to change, you take him at his word. Don't try now to twist it and say nothing except. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes a conversation that says, I am making an absolute statement with an exception. Well, then it's not an absolute statement. So the Rambam says, absolutely nothing in the world is going to change. Comes along the Radvaz and says, yeah, except you meant right that Israel will change. Why? Why would he have said that? Then he would have said clearly that in Israel things will change. So that's our first big question. Our second big question comes from a piece of history that the Rambam makes a point of mentioning with regards to Moshiach. Look at this. Number 2, Beis. Bizman shel ben koiziva. Remember the story? There was a person, originally his name was Bar Kochba, and then they downgraded his name to Ben Koziva because they were so disappointed with him. Bar Kochba comes from the word star, referring to the pasuk, the prediction of Bilam about what would happen. Dorach koichav mi Yaakov, that a star would shoot out from Yaakov, and that's supposed to be an inference to Moshiach. So they saw this rising star who led a powerful rebellion against the Romans. Remember, the Romans are the Edomite kingdom. They are the people who have to fall in order for Moshiach to come. They're the ones who, Yaakov and Esav, started the campaign that would run right through history until eventually Yaakov would have the upper hand, and then then they would come and judge the mountain of Esav, and Hashem would reign supreme over the world. So that's what was happening over here. Here's this man, Shimon, who was called Bar Kochba, who led a revolt against the Romans, held them off for 3 years, the most powerful empire of the time. It was clearly messianic. not only to Rabbi Akiva, but to many of his colleagues. Later on, Bar Kokhba proved not to be the right person, not only because the prophecies didn't manifest, because of certain of his behaviors and choices. And then they called him Ben Koziba, from the word kozov, which means false, the false hope that he gave. But let's not worry about that. Let's just understand, how did Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues think in the first place that Bar Kokhba could be Moshiach? How seriously did they take this belief? Look what the Rebbe says here. Dima ad kedei kach sheyotzenu milchama pikuach nefesh al pi tzivuyoy. They believed so implicitly in Bar Kokhba that they were willing to go to war against the Romans. That was a huge risk to life, and we know how seriously Judaism takes the value of life. So if you don't believe that something is true, we're talking here about Rabbi Akiva. We're not talking about some impressionable teenagers. We're not talking about some naive members of the community, the kind of people who buy into pyramid schemes. We're talking about Rabbi Akiva v'Chaveirov, the greatest sages of Jewish history, who were willing to enter a battlefield at risk to their lives because they believed that this was the battle which is predicted. Yilchoi milchemes Hashem, that he will battle the wars of Hashem. The Rambam quotes this particular story for what reason? To prove to us the Rambam specifically uses this story to show us that Moshiach need not perform any miracles in order to prove himself as Moshiach. Because look, Bar Kokhba did no miracles, and everybody threw their weight behind him, supported him absolutely to the point of personal sacrifice. So now, now, obviously at the time of Bar Kokhba, there were no miracles in the world. There were no trees producing fruit, or wild animals suddenly either becoming docile or disappearing altogether. And where did this happen? This whole story unfolded in Israel. Clearly, the Rambam does not believe that there will be these great miracles in Israel, like the Radvaz wanted to suggest. So two major issues with the Radvaz's suggestions. Number one, the Rambam used a sweeping statement, and the Rambam knows how to be very concise and clear in what he says. The whole world's not going to change. That seems to include Israel. Secondly, he quotes an historical event where the event was meant to be messianic in Israel, and nobody looked for supernatural miracles in Israel. So, Lochein mistaver loimar sheladas harambam liyosit lovei gam beretz Yisrael yiyeh oilam keminhagoi noyeg. So we have to revert back to our original position, which is that the Rambam believes nothing will change anywhere in the world when Moshiach comes. So our original attempt to say that everything is all allegorical in the Midrash and the Gemara, that failed. Our attempt now to suggest that the Rambam distinguishes between Israel, which will be a supernatural, miraculous experience in the time of Moshiach, and the rest of the world won't, has also failed. So we're back to square one. The Rambam says with certainty that the world doesn't change when Moshiach comes, except for anti-Semitism, persecution of the Jews. And yet, he somehow will have to reconcile his opinion with other sources in Torah that are very clear about supernatural change in the time of Moshiach. So we're going to take another angle from a sefer called Avodas HaKodesh, as you're about to discover. And we're going to play a little bit of semantics over here and say, yes, of course, things won't change when Moshiach comes. The world as we know it now is a changed world. This is the aberration. Violence. The fact that not all trees can bear fruit. Dangerous animals. Those are an aberration. It's not how the world was meant to be. So when the Rambam says that the world won't change, he's right. It will go back to how it always was. Sefer Avodas HaKodesh Masbir, the Avodas HaKodesh explains she'olam keminhagoi noeg pirushoi, that the interpretation of saying that the world will not change in the time of Mashiach means HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo yechadesh liyasid lavoi devarim chutz min hateva. It means that Hashem will not introduce anything into the world that is not already somehow part of the nature of the world. Instead, ach kol lo inyanim bivriya hiyu al tiv'am v'shorsham k'mo shehayu b'tchilas havayasam uvriyasam. Instead, Avodas HaKodesh says, you know what the Rambam's saying? The world will be the most natural it has ever been. We are divorced by 5,781 years from the way that the world was meant to be, from what nature is. Nature is how Hashem designed it. Then human beings came along, and we made some mistakes, and therefore we caused a curse on nature. So when Mashiach comes, Olam keminhagoi noyeg, the world will go back to its original minhag, the way it was originally supposed to be. Velochein ein stira midoshas hatoras kehanim anal sheha'etz asid leos natua voisepeiros ben yoima. So, for example, when the Midrash suggests that in the time of Mashiach you'll plant a tree, it will grow in a day and produce fruit on the same day, or any other similar crazy-sounding interpretations or predictions of the sages, don't worry about them. Not one of those suggestions is unnatural. Why not? Because the way Hashem originally designed the world was that trees should produce fruit on the same day they're planted. We don't know this because we've lived for so many centuries in a world that you wait. The idea of instant gratification is in our world seen as a negative. You have to appreciate. You have to be able to delay gratification. The truth is that the original world as Hashem created it was a world of smooth brachas, immediate brachas. The world of download is a world that is how Hashem intended it. And that's the attitude of the Avodas HaKodesh. So he says, you're absolutely right that the Rambam says nothing's going to change. You know, it's like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that if you have a situation that is an unnatural situation, it will only last as long as whatever causes it lasts. So, for example, when Hashem split the sea, it's a miracle to split the sea, but it's not a miracle to put the sea back. That's natural. So all you need to do is remove the interference. Hashem used interference, the wind, the miracle that piled the water so that the Jews could cross. All we need for the sea to cascade down onto the Egyptians again is remove the miracle. So the same kind of logic is what the Avodas HaKodesh wants us to think here. Hashem created a world that is beautiful, that is good, that is blessed, where things come to you easily, where there isn't all the fadrus, the stress, the anxiety, the impediments. That's how Hashem created the world. And then people, because of our choices, we ruined the world. So Adam and Chava, they ate from the tree of knowledge, and as a direct result of that, we know that the Torah said that they're going to have all kinds of challenges in life. That is an interference with the natural way. Moshiach comes, you remove the interference, things start to flow again. You remove the blockage, things flow. It's not miracles. So, al pizeya shloima gam benegel shnei ha'inyonim shebeparsha seinu. This is a sicha on the parsha B'chukoisai. So we can use the same logic to apply to promises that are made in Parshas B'chukoisai about things that will happen in the time of Mashiach, namely, V'ishbati chaya ra'a min ha'aretz, the idea that there will be no dangerous animals, V'ilonei sarak yasu peres, and the idea that all trees will produce fruit. Sheladas Rambam, ein ze nechshav bitul davar miminhag shalolam. None of that is changing the nature of the world. Mishum shekach hoya matzah b'tchilas abriya koidem chet eitz hadas, because that was the reality of the world before the Torah was given. Before they ate from the tree of knowledge. Oz kol oilonos nosu peiros v'achayos kulon lo yiziku. In Gan Eden, every tree produced fruit. We know that because Hashem tells Adam and Chava, Mikol eitz hagan ochol tochel. You can eat from any of the trees in the garden. That implies that every tree produces fruit. And there was no such thing as a dangerous animal in Gan Eden. So what happened? It's just as a result of, as a consequence of the people eating, Adam and Chava eating from the tree of knowledge. Then Hashem said, we're going to change the world. The world will become a place of curses. Kasha Kodesh Baruch Hu Omar, then Hashem says, V'koitz v'dardar tatzmiach, that when you plant things, they're going to come up with thorns and thistles. At the same time, at the same time, some trees were converted to become barren. And certain animals at that point changed to become dangerous animals. But when Mashiach comes, everything will revert back to its original nature. Nothing's going to change. It's a beautiful world. So it's a fantastic commentary from the Avodas HaKodesh because it really seems to settle all of our issues. Our issues were, how does the Rambam make such a sweeping statement that nothing about the world is going to change when we have evidence from classical sources that there will be some major miraculous changes? Well, now you know. They're not miraculous changes. A world where things are peaceful is a world as Hashem created it. You know, very often we don't give enough consideration to the idea that when Hashem created the world, it says very clearly that we were in a Gan. We were in a garden. Gan Eden was a beautiful place. That means that intentionally, right at the beginning of creation, Hashem wanted to paint a picture of a tranquil, serene environment, a beautiful environment, a place of pleasure. In fact, in Shir HaShirim, where it says, Basi Legani, so the Medrash says, Lignuni, comes to a place of pleasure. The garden is supposed to indicate that it's a place of tremendous pleasure, not only pleasure for Hashem, who takes great pride in his creation, but pleasure for us as well, without the distractions, without the threats. So the Avodas HaKodesh has given us a brilliant insight and explanation. The only thing that we'll have to do now, though, is we'll have to look at the different language, because remember, we keep going back to the Medrash and the Gemara, where we said they both effectively say the same thing, but they don't say it in the same way. And if they don't say it in the same way, it must be for a reason. So we had the impression that the Midrash was speaking about a distinction between Israel and the rest of the world, and the Gemara was talking about how the whole world is in the same boat. So how's the Avodas HaKodesh going to explain that? So what we're going to see over here is very interesting, that the Midrash and the Gemara both speak about the same idea, that all trees will produce fruit in the time of Moshiach, but they use very different language. And the difference in the language that they use tells us a whole different story of how they see this panning out. The Midrash says that in the future when Mashiach comes, all trees will produce fruit. Whereas the Gemara uses a very different expression. In the future, all trees will carry fruit. See the difference? The Midrash says they'll all produce fruit, and the Gemara says they'll all carry fruit. So, oisim peres kilashen teras kohanim mashmooi sheilani sark yatzmichu peres ba'oifen ativi boy kolatzem atzem acholosim peres. According to the Midrash, what will happen is the same natural process that happens on an apple tree will now happen on a willow tree. Whatever fruit it will produce in a natural fashion. Leuma zois, lashon haGemara yit'anu moira shadavar lo yeh kegidul tivi b'ilonois ela hem yit'anu yisu al atzmam davar shebe'etzem eino shayach lohem. Whereas the Gemara says that they will carry fruits. So that's a strange word to use for fruits on a tree, and therefore it implies that they won't actually grow the fruit. It'll almost be like the fruits will manifest on the tree in some supernatural way. Now, the Midrash and the Gemara respectively didn't just come up with these ideas on their own. They actually based their interpretation on different verses, different psukim. yitain perioi. The Medrash bases its interpretation on this parasha, where it says that the fruits, that all of the trees of the field will give forth fruit, which means they'll produce fruit. Which implies that it's a normal way of fruit manifesting on trees, growing on trees. Whereas the Gemara quotes a different pasuk, not from the Chumash, where it says, Ki eitz nasa perioi, a tree will carry its fruit, ta'ena v'gefen nasnu chelam, and the fig and the vine will give their produce. Okay, Rashi immediately points out, Rashi says that seems like a superfluous pasuk, because you've already told me that fruit trees like the vine and the figs are going to give forth their fruits. Why then did you have to say before that the eitz hasadeh nasa period, that the other trees are going to carry their fruits? Klaimar. In other words, what he's telling us is that the additional expression is to teach us that non-fruit bearing trees will start to bear fruit. Let me just say, Klaimar, Pasuk Madgish, the Torah is emphasizing in that Pasuk 4 things. Aleph, number one, that there will be a difference in how it works on fruit trees and how it works on previously non-fruit bearing trees. Second of all, it tells us that the difference will be that fruit trees will produce fruit in the normal way. They'll give as they are normally supposed to give. It's their produce. The fourth point is that if it's a non-fruit bearing tree, it will now have fruit, but as if somebody's like hung fruits, like you're doing your sukkah, hung fruits onto the tree. Okay, we'll have to see if I don't know if we have enough time for this now. I think we're going to actually have to pause there. We'll have to pick this up next week. So, let's just summarize what we have learned. What we have learned is this. The Rambam says that in the time of Moshiach, the world remains a natural world with certain adjustments in terms of geopolitics. So nobody's going to treat us badly. We wanted to know how you reconcile that with other sources, most specifically the Medrash Toras Kohanim and the Gemara Ksuvas, both speaking about how non-fruit-bearing trees in the time of Moshiach will produce fruit. We thought we could argue and say, well, that's actually just allegorical. We dismissed that. We thought we could say that's only in the land of Israel, like the Radvaz wants to say. We dismissed that too. So now we're going with the attempt of the Avodas HaKodesh, which says, well, actually, it's not unnatural. It's a completely natural thing. The world's going back to how it was before. We're analyzing different nuances in the language because according to the Midrash, it's completely natural. The whole world goes back to a completely natural state where all trees produce fruit. And the Gemara doesn't seem to say that. The Gemara seems to say that it will be natural for all trees to have fruit, but they won't necessarily produce them in the natural way. And that's where we have to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to look at a different Medrash in order to try and help and understand that. But as I said, we'll have to do that next week just because of time.